And so I thought, if the incarnation, as we understand it, where Jesus came to earth, is just the beginning, then how does Jesus continue to empty himself? How does Jesus continue to incarnate? How does Jesus continue to not cling to his power and privilege and equality with God as he's interacting with human beings as a human being? Because that's actually a model that I can sort of follow. That's a human being doing things on earth. Let's look at that. So I created my own biblical hermeneutic, which, I'm at a divinity school now, so it's okay, don't worry. And what I decided to do is go through the entire Gospels, looking to see how is Jesus understanding his social situation? How does Jesus have a sociological imagination? How does Jesus locate himself relative to other people in his world? And how does he empty himself of his power and privilege in that specific situation? Because we often think about Jesus as being oppressed, and in a lot of ways he was. Let's face it, his parents had to sacrifice 2 doves when he got circumcised, and that's like the poor man's sacrifice. Actually, you're supposed to sacrifice 2 sheep. So that's some evidence that Jesus, came from a lower income family. Jesus was also Jewish, under Roman occupation, so he certainly identified with an oppressed group. But on the flip side, Jesus was not Samaritan, so he had some power and privilege in society relative to Samaritans. Jesus was male and not female, so he had some standing over women. Jesus was free in a slave society. Jesus' family was important enough to be counted in the census, which meant that they were seen as actual human beings. Not everyone was counted in a census. And so, in some ways, Jesus had privilege and power and voice and platform, and certainly in his ministry as a leader and as a rabbi, teacher, he had voice. And so, I'm thinking, when we look at Jesus in different scenarios throughout the scripture, how can we see how Jesus is emptying himself in order to make space for other people, in order to advance the causes and the voices of people who have been marginalized? Exactly how does Jesus do what Paul's inviting us to do, coming together as one in mind and spirit and purpose, sharing in the same love that the Trinity shares? And so I'll give you an example of one passage, but one of my favorites is the story of Jairus and the woman who had been bleeding for 12 years. And it shows up in all 3 of the Synoptic Gospels. And it's a fascinating story from a social perspective, because here we have Jesus, who is very early in his ministry career. He's sort of this up-and-coming leader, up-and-coming rabbi, and he's come from the margins, Nazareth, where nothing good could ever come from Nazareth. And up until this point, he's really only been healing and working and teaching the marginalized. He's healed a couple lepers. He's, healed some blind people. He's been nice to some women, but for the most part, the important people in society have not participated in Jesus's ministry. And then comes Jairus, who's a rabbi, a leader in the synagogue, a very important person. This is like the white guy, right? This is like the middle-class, heterosexual, upwardly mobile white guy, right? He's got all the privilege in society. And he says, "My daughter is sick. Please come heal my daughter." And so Jesus loves white guys too and says, "Yes, I will come heal your daughter. Absolutely." And he starts walking with Jairus. Meanwhile, there are thousands of people clamoring to talk to Jesus, to touch Jesus. And this woman who'd been bleeding for 12 years touches Jesus, him, just his clothes. And all 3 of the Synoptic Gospels say it exactly as they say. And Jesus felt the power go out of him, and she was healed. It was done. She was healed. And then Jesus asks a question. Jesus says, "Who touched me?" After she had already been healed, and he knew it. And Jairus is waiting. This important person is waiting. And so as a social psychologist and as someone who's looking at Jesus, at the Gospels through this hermeneutic, I'm thinking, why would Jesus ask that question? Up until this point, all eyes are on Jesus, who has power and privilege in this space, and on Jairus, who has power and privilege in this space and in society. And by simply asking that one question, who touched me, which everyone thought was ridiculous, even the disciples, they're like, that's the dumbest question ever. Everyone's touching you, right? By asking the question, Jesus shifts all the focus in that entire community from him and Jairus to this woman, and she gets to tell her story. And I love the way Mark tells it. He says, and she told her whole truth. This woman who probably smelled horribly at this point, this woman who was most likely homeless, because in the theology of that day, if you were sick, that meant you were spiritually sick, you were sinful, and so families could kick you to the curb and no one would think any less of them for it. She had been marginalized. She probably had no money. She probably looked very sick. She was the kind of person that no one in that whole culture would possibly think, this woman is the center of what God is doing right now. And she gets to tell her whole truth. And I have a feeling 12 years of being sick in that society, I'm guessing her whole truth was not short. She's talking and she's sharing and her story is coming out and Jesus is listening and listening. And meanwhile, Jairus is standing there waiting and waiting and waiting and listening to this woman tell her whole truth. And at any moment, Jairus could have easily said, all right, Jesus, let's wrap this up. I'm glad good for her. However, I have needs, right? And a real need. My daughter's dying. Let's go, Jesus. And I don't think anybody would have questioned that, because in that society, he had all the power, right? It's like Jairus could easily intervene and say, yeah, okay, let's move along. Because in their society, just like our society, the needs and the desires and the perspectives and the wants and the interpretations of privileged people are typically seen as more valid, more important, more urgent than those of the marginalized. Yeah, her story is good, but my story, Jesus, I want you to be part of my story. Jairus didn't do that, which I think is telling. At least there's no record of Jairus doing that. Jairus waited and he listened and he heard her story just like everybody else got to hear her story. And that woman, for the first time in her life, I imagine, was the center of what was happening in that community, was the center of what God was doing in that community. And certainly she was physically healed, but I cannot imagine that her identity was not healed in that moment as well, too.
Let's face it, the comfortable narratives we tell ourselves about faith and justice are often shattered by the jarring dissonance of real-world inequality. We like to think we're good, that our intentions are pure, but the question remains, how do those who hold privilege, especially within the Christian faith, navigate their role in a world where the scales are so profoundly tipped? Dr. Christina Cleveland's insights aren't a gentle pat on the back. They're a bracing splash of cold water, a necessary jolt to awaken us from our slumber of complacency. She forces us to look beyond the thoughts and prayers and delve into the murky, often uncomfortable depths of privilege and its insidious impact on the pursuit of equality. Her message isn't a soothing balm for the conscience, a feel-good sermon. It's a call to arms, a challenge to confront the ways in which our very positions within society shape our understanding of faith and justice. Cleveland's work compels us to ditch the platitudes and engage in a profound reckoning with the power dynamics that perpetuate inequality. She throws down the gauntlet, asking, how does our understanding of God, often filtered through our cultural lens, actually translate into action? How does privilege, that invisible cloak we wear without even realizing it, distort our perceptions of justice and fairness? And, most importantly, how can we, as Christians, truly embody the radical love and humility of Jesus in a world fractured by division and injustice? A world where love thy neighbor feels more like a suggestion than a commandment. This isn't just an academic exercise, a talk shop for theologians. It's a vital, urgent conversation, particularly for Black and colored majority communities who have historically shouldered the crushing weight of systemic oppression. Communities where justice delayed is justice denied rings with a painful truth. Cleveland's insights provide a framework for understanding the role of privileged Christians in the struggle for racial justice, a call to dismantle the structures of domination, and a vision for a more equitable future, a future where liberty and justice for all isn't just a catchy phrase. By examining the concept of self-emptying or akenesis as modeled by Jesus, Cleveland challenges us to relinquish our own comfort and privilege in service to others. She urges us to amplify the voices of the marginalized, to challenge the narratives that perpetuate stereotypes, and to confront the fears that hinder our pursuit of justice. This essay will explore the central themes of Cleveland's message, examining its implications for both privileged Christians and the communities they are called to serve. We'll delve into the ways in which privilege distorts our perceptions, the importance of cultural understanding and faith, and the urgent need for action beyond mere conversation, because talk is cheap. Ultimately, it's a call to look into the uncomfortable mirror of our own privilege and to embrace the transformative power of radical love and solidarity, to move beyond being merely woke and truly become awake, to trade the comfortable illusion of our righteousness for the difficult, yet necessary, work of building a world where the last shall be first is more than just a biblical promise, it's a lived reality.
If you find any comfort from being in the anointed, if Creator God's love brings you some encouragement, if you experience true companionship with the Spirit, if God's tenderness and mercy fill your heart, then everyone, here is one thing that would complete my joy. Come together as one in mind and spirit and purpose, sharing in the same love. Don't let selfishness and prideful agendas take over. Embrace true humility and lift your heads to extend love to others. Get beyond yourselves and protecting your own interests. Be sincere and secure your neighbor's interest first. In other words, adopt the mindset of Jesus the Anointed. Live with Jesus's attitude in your hearts. Remember, though he was in the form of God, he chose not to cling to equality with God, but he poured himself out to fill a vessel brand new, a servant in form, and a man indeed, the very likeness of humanity. He humbled himself, obedient to death, a merciless death on the cross. So God raised him up to the highest place and gave Jesus the name above all. So when Jesus' name is called, every knee will bow in heaven, on earth, and below, and every tongue will confess Jesus, the Anointed One, is God, to the glory of God. Amen. This passage is so rich. It's from Philippians 2. It's one that's commonly read, particularly the poem in the second half where Paul, presumably, is telling us about this journey that Jesus went on, this way in which Jesus demonstrated his humble and sacrificial love for us. And the reason why I want to start with that here is because I often talk with privileged people, and I'm writing a book on privilege, and I'm going to share a little bit from that book today. When I often talk to privileged people, and by privileged people I mean you all, they love this passage. They often say to me, I want to be humble like that. I want to, this passage inspires me. I want to have unity, the unity that Paul's talking about. I want to be sincere in my love for other people. I want to be of one mind. I don't like it that there are people who are hungry, and there are people who are victims of racism, and there are people who are refugees, and there are people who are negatively affected by our government, or incarcerated, and they say, help, I want to do well. And so I say, well, what's your plan? And they say, oh, I just want to be humble like Jesus. And I'm like, that sounds kind of vague. What do you mean by that? Just humble like Jesus. And oftentimes they'll like kind of point to this passage. And if there's one thing I've learned in my research and in my life, as someone who identifies with both privileged and oppressed groups, is that whenever privileged people try to do something with humility, oppressed people usually get hurt. Because what makes sense to privileged people often does not make sense to people who don't have that same standing. And it's often actually alienating, silencing, and oppressive. And so I thought, I do like this passage. I'm like anyone else who's, inspired by this passage. And I think it's beautiful. Jesus did not cling to his equality with God, but he came down to earth. And I thought, okay, is it possible for us to create a model of humility across power lines in the way that Jesus sort of crosses power lines in this passage? And this passage is really, oftentimes we associate it with the incarnation, right? Jesus kind of crossing these metaphysical planes in order to come be with us. And as much as I'm inspired by that and intrigued by that, my human mind doesn't quite comprehend that. And I certainly am not personally capable of crossing metaphysical planes like Jesus did. And so it's hard to build a model off of that. But one thing that I've noticed in my scholarship is that the incarnation, even though we focus that idea on Jesus coming down to earth, however it went down, taking on the flesh, Jesus was actually incarnational in the way that Paul's talking about after he already got to earth. Paul's using, in this passage where Paul's talking about how Jesus emptied himself, he's using this Greek word kenosis, which means emptying or letting go. And so he's saying,
Jesus is emptying himself of his power and his privilege, not clinging to his equality with God. And Jesus keeps emptying himself and emptying himself and emptying himself until he's on the cross, until there's no more to give. And so I thought, if the incarnation, as we understand it, where Jesus came to earth, is just the beginning, then how does Jesus continue to empty himself? How does Jesus continue to incarnate? How does Jesus continue to not cling to his power and privilege and equality with God as he's interacting with human beings as a human being? Because that's actually a model that I can sort of follow. That's a human being doing things on earth. Let's look at that. So I created my own biblical hermeneutic, which, I'm at a divinity school now, so it's okay, don't worry. And what I decided to do is go through the entire Gospels, looking to see how is Jesus understanding his social situation? How does Jesus have a sociological imagination? How does Jesus locate himself relative to other people in his world? And how does he empty himself of his power and privilege in that specific situation? Because we often think about Jesus as being oppressed, and in a lot of ways he was. Let's face it, his parents had to sacrifice 2 doves when he got circumcised, and that's like the poor man's sacrifice. Actually, you're supposed to sacrifice 2 sheep. So that's some evidence that Jesus, came from a lower income family. Jesus was also Jewish, under Roman occupation, so he certainly identified with an oppressed group. But on the flip side, Jesus was not Samaritan, so he had some power and privilege in society relative to Samaritans. Jesus was male and not female, so he had some standing over women. Jesus was free in a slave society. Jesus' family was important enough to be counted in the census, which meant that they were seen as actual human beings. Not everyone was counted in a census. And so, in some ways, Jesus had privilege and power and voice and platform, and certainly in his ministry as a leader and as a rabbi, teacher, he had voice. And so, I'm thinking, when we look at Jesus in different scenarios throughout the scripture, how can we see how Jesus is emptying himself in order to make space for other people, in order to advance the causes and the voices of people who have been marginalized? Exactly how does Jesus do what Paul's inviting us to do, coming together as one in mind and spirit and purpose, sharing in the same love that the Trinity shares? And so I'll give you an example of one passage, but one of my favorites is the story of Jairus
and the woman who had been bleeding for 12 years. And it shows up in all three of the synoptic gospels. And it's a fascinating story from a social perspective, because here we have Jesus, who is very early in his ministry career. He's sort of this up-and-coming leader, up-and-coming rabbi. And he's come from the margins, Nazareth, where nothing good could ever come from Nazareth. And up until this point, he's really only been healing and working and teaching the marginalized. He's healed a couple lepers. He's, healed some blind people. He's been nice to some women, but for the most part, the important people in society have not participated in Jesus's ministry. And then comes Jairus, who's a rabbi, a leader in the synagogue, a very important person. This is like the white guy, right? This is like the middle-class, heterosexual, upwardly mobile white guy, right? He's got all the privilege in society. And he says, my daughter is sick. Please come heal my daughter. And so Jesus loves white guys too and says, yes, I will come heal your daughter. Absolutely. And he starts walking with Jairus. Meanwhile, there are thousands of people clamoring to talk to Jesus, to touch Jesus. And this woman who'd been bleeding for 12 years touches Jesus, his hem, just his clothes. And all three of the synoptic gospels say it exactly as they say. And Jesus felt the power go out of him, and she was healed. It was done. She was healed. And then Jesus asks a question. Jesus says, who touched me? After she had already been healed, and he knew it. And Jairus is waiting. This important person is waiting. And so as a social psychologist and as someone who's looking at Jesus, at the Gospels through this hermeneutic, I'm thinking, why would Jesus ask that question? Up until this point, all eyes are on Jesus, who has power and privilege in this space, and on Jairus, who has power and privilege in this space and in society. And by simply asking that one question, who touched me, which everyone thought was ridiculous, even the disciples, they're like, that's the dumbest question ever. Everyone's touching you, right? By asking the question, Jesus shifts all the focus in that entire community from him and Jairus to this woman, and she gets to tell her story. And I love the way Mark tells it. He says, and she told her whole truth. This woman who probably smelled horribly at this point, this woman who was most likely homeless, because in the theology of that day, if you were sick, that meant you were spiritually sick, you were sinful, and so families could kick you to the curb and no one would think any less of them for it. She had been marginalized. She probably had no money. She probably looked very sick. She was the kind of person that no one in that whole culture would possibly think, this woman is the center of what God is doing right now. And she gets to tell her whole truth. And I have a feeling 12 years of being sick in that society, I'm guessing her whole truth was not short. She's talking and she's sharing and her story is coming out and Jesus is listening and listening. And meanwhile, Jairus is standing there waiting and waiting and waiting and listening to this woman tell her whole truth. And at any moment, Jairus could have easily said, all right, Jesus, let's wrap this up. I'm glad good for her. However, I have needs, right? And a real need. My daughter's dying. Let's go, Jesus. And I don't think anybody would have questioned that, because in that society, he had all the power, right? It's like Jairus could easily intervene and say, yeah, okay, let's move along. Because in their society, just like our society, The needs and the desires and the perspectives and the wants and the interpretations of privileged people are typically seen as more valid, more important, more urgent than those of the marginalized. Yeah, her story is good, but my story, Jesus, I want you to be part of my story. Jairus didn't do that, which I think is telling. At least there's no record of Jairus doing that. Jairus waited and he listened. And he heard her story just like everybody else got to hear her story. And that woman, for the first time in her life, I imagine, was the center of what was happening in that community, was the center of what God was doing in that community. And certainly she was physically healed, but I cannot imagine that her identity was not healed in that moment as well, too. And then, and this is the part that's so chilling, Jairus gets the word, your daughter has died. Don't even bother the teacher anymore. She's gone. And as someone who's been researching the way privileged people sort of interpret the world, what their fears are, I'm like, this is like every privileged person's greatest fear, right? While other people are getting the attention and the equality that they've always deserved, that's going to impact me in a negative way, right? If my job makes a point of intentionally hiring women of color, well, then what's going to happen to me? Am I going to get promoted? Wait, oh my gosh. Or if this school institutes affirmative action to try to right an institutional wrong, well, is my son going to be able to get in? And if I give sacrificially of my money, are my bills going to be paid? Will I have what I need? Will I be able to send my kids to college? If we just let anybody move into the neighborhood, will I feel safe? This is like every privileged person's fear. If you don't believe me, just believe me, actually. This is what I hear over and over and over again. And the reason why I know this to be true is not just from the research I've done with interviews I've conducted with people, but there's a recent sociological finding that comes out that says that when privileged people, and this study was particularly done on white men, when privileged people are required to participate in a system of equality, where everyone actually gets the same resources and they don't get extra or any boost, it feels like discrimination to them. The psychological experience is comparable to the psychological experience that, like, say, women of color have when they're actually being discriminated against, right? Okay, so just to be clear, treating everyone the same is by definition equality. Okay, so they're not being discriminated against, but it feels like it. So that kind of helps us understand what Jairus was probably feeling. Yeah, Jesus, I'm glad that you're paying attention to this woman, but meanwhile, I'm not getting what I need. And do I really want to participate in a world where I'm not guaranteed to get what I need, even if it means giving someone else what they need? And when I think about that, those fears, the fear that I'm not going to get mine if I really participate in equality and in equity, is really a fear that comes out of a theology of scarcity, not abundance. And when I'm tempted to feel that way myself, I have to ask myself, do I really believe in the resurrection? Because if I really believe in the resurrection, which we presumably just celebrated not too long ago, then I have to believe that there's enough power and enough love and enough resources to go around. And I don't have to fear. Actually, I'm invited to participate in the work that God is doing and making things right. And that's exactly what Jesus was doing. Jesus was saying there's an imbalance in this community. And this woman for 12 years has been neglected and nobody's cared about her needs. And she's never been the center of anything. And so, yeah, Jairus, I'm going to put you on hold for a second. so she gets to tell her whole truth. And sure enough, Jairus' people came and they said, your daughter's dead, don't even worry. And Jesus says to Jairus, have faith, just believe. Just believe. Just believe that there's abundance. Just believe that there's enough for you too. And what's so interesting to me, and I can't prove this, but Jairus was able to have that faith. And he was still able to go with Jesus to his home. And Jesus went to his home and resurrected his daughter, which I feel like is like extra miracle, like she was just going to be healed. And then he got to actually witness a resurrection. That's pretty cool. But he was able to trust because he could have easily just been like, oh yeah, Jesus, forget it. I'm mad that you took time to care about this woman. And I'm just hurt because it's not about me. And it's hard when it's not about me. But he still had faith. And I can't prove this, but I look at this, and I look at the way that I understand the interdependence of humanity, the interdependence of God, the way that we're called to be in relationship with each other, the way in which one person's liberation is bound up in another person's liberation. And I think Jairus got to hear this woman's whole truth. And in hearing that whole truth, he was able to have the faith that he needed in order to trust when Jesus said, there's abundance. We like to believe that we have to just get what we need and that our story is separate from other people's stories. But I can't imagine watching Jesus heal that woman and not being affected, not being encouraged, not being nourished, not having greater faith that, yeah, Jesus can heal. Jesus can do anything. Jesus can change the whole reality. And so when I look at passages like this and I see the way that Jesus is so savvy, he had a sociological imagination. He understood, I'm located here, other people are located here, and I'm going to empty myself. I'm going to turn the spotlight to other people. I'm going to use my voice to amplify other people's voices, or just get out of the way and make space for them to speak for themselves. I'm going to center the perspectives of the marginalized and invite the entire community to do that as well. And we see this in every single interaction that Jesus has, where he's emptying himself of his power and his privilege, and he just keeps emptying himself and emptying himself and emptying himself until really there's just nothing left and he's on the cross. He was so adamant about disrupting the power structure that people had to kill him. It was too offensive to them. And so I think, okay, so this is what being just humble like Jesus looks like. All right, okay. So if I want to empty myself like Jesus did, if I want to participate in kenosis, then I need to actually take inventory of what exactly it is that I want to empty, right? This vague humility is not really going to get me anywhere. And so that's really the first step that I think in terms of action. What do I have to take? What do I have to empty myself of? What are the ways in which I identify with privileged groups? What are the ways in which I actually have power and privilege relative to other people? I was speaking at a conference a couple years ago with this guy who, how do I say this without, I want him to be anonymous. He is very, very, very high up of like probably a Fortune 50 company, and I'm sure everyone, your household is full of things from this company. And so he and I were talking, and he was telling me about how he sees his faith, because he's a person of faith, interacting with his work. And I said, okay, so tell me, what exactly is it that, how does your faith impact you? And he's like, well, I try to be really honest on the job. So personal honesty is, and he says, and I try not to neglect my wife. I want to be nice to her and not be too much of a workaholic so that she feels loved. And I'm like, good. I'm glad you're nice to your wife. And that was like the end of it, right? That was like his, and I was like, okay, I'm glad you're honest, I'm glad you're nice to your wife. I'm pro all those things. But I was like, what is the point of being in this position at this company if you're not asking questions like, how come kids in low-income urban schools don't have access to our product? How come our entire board is white men? How come when we put on these huge conferences, the people who are spotlighted the most are white men or white people? And so he hadn't taken inventory, right? He just wanted to be vaguely humble. And I was like, yeah, that's great. Be honest. That's good. But he hadn't thought about, well, how exactly do I have influence? And what would it look like for me to empty myself of that influence? You know, and this is something that is it's simple but costly. And I've been amazed at the types of people who are willing to go down this journey, and it's not always the people that I think will. Because the fact of the matter is that this journey took Jesus to the cross because it was so offensive to people. And we often think, well, this journey, we can sort of juggle this and everything else that we do, right? It's, I can still keep my position and also kind of dabble a little bit in justice work. And if I just listen to enough podcasts about racism and read enough books and have a couple of conversations that don't really cost me much, and then I'm participating in this. But the fact of the matter is, we can't get away from this, is that this journey took Jesus to the cross. And this journey also took him to the resurrection. So there's, a light at the end of the tunnel. But I've been amazed at the people who are willing to go on this journey to really take inventory. And oftentimes it's people who are, I just don't suspect it. So for example, I was contacted by a group of women, this is probably 4 years ago now, who were really interested in, they're a group of stay-at-home moms, white, upper middle class, and they were part of a group that gathered moms to pray for the kids at their local school because all their kids went to that school. So again, one of these like really nice, positive groups. But what they said to me was, we live on one side of town that's upwardly mobile, white, predominantly white. And then we share a high school with the other side of town, which is low income, predominantly Hispanic. And so they said, we recognize that the school's like 50-50 white, Hispanic. And so there probably are all these Latina moms who would want to pray with us, but we haven't been able to connect with that group. We've been trying to get them to come to our prayer time, but they won't come. And I will add, they were a little whiny about it. Like, they won't come, like they're rejecting us. And I'm like, okay, so what have you tried? And they said, well, we put out some flyers in some of the Spanish-speaking churches, and we sent out a few email invitations. And I said, okay. And again, like these are just regular people, right? And so I wasn't expecting much, but I thought, all right, well, what is it about your life that makes, I asked them, I'm getting ahead of myself. I asked them, when does your group meet? And they said 11 o'clock on Thursday morning. Okay. Okay, and so I said, well, what is it about your life that makes you available at 11 o'clock on Thursday morning? And they said, their response was, well, actually, we got together with our spouses and we decided, we really love our kids and we really want to prioritize someone being home with them. So we chose to stay home, and that's why we're available at 11 o'clock on Thursday morning. And I thought, and I said to them, wow, that's the wrong answer. And what's amazing, and what we talked about yesterday afternoon, is the ways in which we want to feel good about our group. And so, of course, their explanation for why they were available at 11 o'clock on a Thursday morning was going to be about how awesome they were and how much they loved their kids, right? That's normal human, that's how we organize our world. We want to feel good about our group. And so I just said, well, actually, that's not the right answer. Why do you think you're available at 11 o'clock on a Thursday morning? And they said, we don't know. If that's not the answer, we don't know. And I said, that's fair. You're being honest. That's awesome. So I said, here's what I want you to do. Don't call me back for at least 3 months. Take your families, and I was talking to 5 women who were the leaders of this group of about 25 women. And so I said, take your families, leave your church where everyone's like you, and go and participate in an Hispanic church and get to know people and share life and share brain space. And when you figured out what it is about your life that makes you available at 11 o'clock on a Thursday morning, call me back. And I was trying to get them to take inventory. What is it that you have because of your social location that other people don't have? Because we can't talk about giving anything up if you're not even aware of what it is that you have. And I say this kind of stuff to people all the time, right? I mean, I'm always like challenging people to do this and that. And usually people are like, I understand exactly what you're saying. No. Because the fact of the matter is we're inspired by this passage, but no one actually wants to live it. We're too afraid of the whole concept of cross. And because of that, we actually don't really get to participate in resurrection. And we live these very shallow lives. My friends who live in Rwanda are like, we pray for you. We pray for you, Western Christians, because you don't even know what hope is. You don't even know what resurrection is. And so usually people just say no. Like, I hear your challenge, and no, I'm too comfortable. But these women surprised me. They were amazing. They were like, all right, we'll do it. And I was like, okay. And they actually didn't call me back for about 6 months. And they called me back, and the first thing one of the women said, they're like, oh my gosh, we have so much to talk to you about. And I said, okay. And and the leader said, but the first thing I want to say is, for the first time in my life, I have flesh on my bones. And she said, how could I ever go back? How could I ever go back? And they said, but we learned all these things. They're like, first of all, we have all these Latina sisters now. And we learned all these things about their lives and our lives. And one of them was like, hey, one of the things we learned is they love their kids as much as we do. I was like, probably more, Like, they were like, but they want to pray with us, but many are working multiple jobs. And many of them have lots of pressures on their lives, and many of them do not have private transportation, and getting around town on the buses is time-consuming. And many of them don't always feel safe in their neighborhood. And so waiting for the bus can even be scary. So they said, so we just went ahead and changed, because they were supposed to come back and talk to me, and then we were supposed to come up with a plan. No, didn't do that, which is great. They were like, we just went ahead and changed the time of our prayer group. We meet at 11 p.m. on a Thursday night in the home of one of the moms, Latina moms, because they said, we realized we have private transportation, we have access to childcare, all of us are stay-at-home moms, so if we need to rearrange our schedule on Friday morning to compensate for the fact that we're out really late, we can do that. They were like, we realized there was this barrier. We wanted unity, but we wanted it on our terms. We didn't want to have to give up anything. We didn't want to have to make a sacrifice. And they're like, we realized it wasn't going to work that way. So they were like, we've been meeting now at 11 p.m. on Thursday night. And they were like, now we have about 25 white moms coming. We have about 20 Latina moms coming. We're packing out this apartment that we're in. And then like 3 months later, they call me back and they were like, some of the Latina moms said that way more moms would come, except for they don't speak English. And so one of the white moms was like, all right, cool, I'll pay for a translator, not a big deal. And so we got a translator, and then they said, we white women realized that we needed to learn Spanish. So about 12 of them signed up for classes and started learning Spanish because they said, why should they have to learn English? Again, they're taking inventory, right? These are not sociology majors, right? These are not people who could give you a lecture on power and privilege, but every single time they were invited to empty themselves, like Jesus, they emptied themselves. And they said, all right, so we're going to start learning. And so a bunch of them started learning Spanish. And then about 6 months later, they called me back. And they were like, our group, we definitely still pray for sure. But now we mostly just do immigration reform work. Because how can you not, right? How can it not lead to actually putting your own values and resources and time on the line in cross-cultural advocacy in the same way that Jesus came to earth and took on a whole set of human problems and issues and fears and concerns that were nothing like his own, what he experienced in the Trinity. And so they said, we had no idea that our sisters live in fear all the time that someone in their family is going to get deported. We had no idea that our county has chosen to define residency in a way that excludes people who are not citizens. And so therefore, people who might want to have access to public hospitals or public education and some of the things that the county should provide are not able. So they've gotten involved with that. And one of the things that, like I said, this group is surprising because this isn't the group that you would assume. These aren't the people who talk the talk, right? These aren't the people who listen to all the podcasts and read all the books. Actually, I'm a little wary of those people. These are people who knew nothing, and every step of the way, when they had an opportunity to empty themselves, they simply said yes. We'll ask questions later, but yes. And I think that's the challenge for those of us. I think it's so easy, particularly those of us who identify as progressive Christians, which I do as well, to think that we're doing enough just by having the conversation. But at the same time, we are holding on to all the power. Our lives haven't changed in terms of our social interactions, in terms of where we spend our time, who we spend it with, how we actually spend our money, how we're intervening and advocating at our jobs in ways that actually might hurt us, where maybe it's not the popular thing to kind of come off as the progressive one. Maybe it's not the popular thing to say, actually, I'm going to insist on this next hire being someone who comes from a marginalized community and taking the hits. But one thing I've noticed, and one thing that I love about this passage too, and that we know from Jesus' life, is that this is the pathway to salvation. This is the pathway. It's by salvation, I mean wholeness. By salvation, I mean equity between people in our world. This is the pathway. And this is what we get to benefit from when we go down this path, which, yes, does lead to death. It leads to crosses. But we can't truly experience resurrection without that. And one of the things that I've learned so much in my work around the theology of reconciliation is that reconciliation really has one foot in the cross and one foot in the resurrection. It's both. The way it's often been talked about, particularly in white communities, is it's just resurrection. Like, yay, kumbaya, let's come together. But no one wants to pay the price for it. And so this is our invitation, this is our opportunity. And like the woman who said, I feel like for the first time in my life I have flesh on my bones, I have never found anyone who's truly gone down this path who's ever wanted to go back.
Dr. Christina Cleveland's insights on how privileged Christians can strategically work for equality resonate with a profound urgency, particularly for Black and colored majority communities who have historically borne the brunt of systemic injustice. Her message is not merely a theological exercise. It is a call to action, a challenge to dismantle the very structures that perpetuate inequality. By examining her core arguments through the lens of lived experiences within marginalized communities, we can illuminate the transformative potential of her message and the critical implications it holds. Cleveland's emphasis on understanding cultural differences in faith is a crucial starting point. For Black and colored communities, the experience of faith is often interwoven with the realities of oppression, resilience, and cultural preservation. The spiritual traditions of these communities have often served as a source of strength, a space for collective healing, and a means of resistance against systemic marginalization. Recognizing the diverse expressions of faith within these communities, from the vibrant traditions of the Black church to the syncretic practices of Latinx communities, is essential for fostering genuine empathy. Ignoring these cultural nuances risks perpetuating a monolithic understanding of Christianity that centers the experiences of the dominant culture. This can lead to well-intentioned but ultimately harmful interventions that fail to address the specific needs and realities of marginalized communities. Acknowledging the richness and complexity of faith within these communities is not just an act of respect. It is a prerequisite for building authentic relationships and fostering meaningful change. Cleveland's call for privileged Christians to adopt humility and serve others directly challenges the power dynamics that underpin systemic inequality. For Black and colored communities, the experience of being on the receiving end of well-intentioned but ultimately paternalistic help is all too familiar. True service, as Cleveland suggests, requires a radical shift in perspective, a willingness to relinquish control and prioritize the needs of others. This means actively listening to the voices of marginalized communities, centering their experiences, and supporting their leadership. It means challenging the implicit biases that perpetuate stereotypes and undermine agency. It means dismantling the structures of domination that privilege certain groups at the expense of others. For Black and colored communities, this translates to advocating for equitable resource distribution, challenging discriminatory policies, and amplifying their voices in spaces where they have historically been silenced. Cleveland's exploration of Jesus' self-emptying kenosis provides a powerful model for radical solidarity. For Black and colored communities, Jesus' willingness to relinquish power and privilege resonates deeply with their own experiences of marginalization. His actions demonstrate a commitment to standing in solidarity with the oppressed, a willingness to challenge the status quo, and a profound love for those on the margins. This understanding of kenosis calls for a profound transformation in how privileged Christians engage with issues of racial justice. It requires a willingness to confront their own complicity in systems of oppression, to acknowledge the ways in which they benefit from inequality, and to actively work to dismantle those systems. For Black and colored communities, this means finding allies who are willing to share in the burden of struggle, who are committed to amplifying their voices, and who are willing to risk their own comfort for the sake of justice. Cleveland's emphasis on supporting marginalized voices is essential for creating a more just and equitable society. For Black and colored communities, the experience of being silenced, ignored, and dismissed is a daily reality. Their stories, their perspectives, and their experiences are often relegated to the margins, their voices deemed less important than those of the dominant culture. Centering the experiences of marginalized communities requires a deliberate effort to create spaces where their voices can be heard and amplified. It means challenging the narratives that perpetuate stereotypes and undermine agency. It means valuing their lived experiences as a source of knowledge and wisdom. For Black and colored communities, this means reclaiming their narratives, challenging the dominant discourse, and asserting their right to self-determination. Cleveland's recognition of the fears that privileged individuals experience in the pursuit of equality is crucial for understanding the resistance to change. For Black and colored communities, the fear of losing privilege is often rooted in a deep-seated belief in scarcity, belief that there is not enough to go around. This fear is often used to justify the hoarding of resources and the perpetuation of inequality. Confronting this fear requires a shift in perspective, a recognition that true abundance comes from sharing, not hoarding. It requires a willingness to challenge the narratives that perpetuate fear and division. It requires a commitment to building a society where everyone has the opportunity to thrive. For Black and colored communities, this means challenging the narratives that perpetuate stereotypes and undermine their humanity, and demanding a society that values equity and justice. Cleveland's call for privileged Christians to leverage their influence for equality is a challenge to move beyond personal ethics and engage in systemic change. For Black and colored communities, the experience of discrimination is not just a matter of individual prejudice. It is rooted in systemic inequalities that perpetuate disadvantage. Leveraging influence means using one's position to challenge discriminatory policies, advocate for equitable resource distribution, and amplify the voices of marginalized communities. It means holding institutions accountable for their role in perpetuating inequality. For Black and colored communities, this means demanding representation in positions of power, challenging discriminatory hiring practices, and advocating for policies that address systemic disparities. Cleveland's emphasis on meaningful engagement and learning is essential for building bridges of understanding and fostering genuine solidarity. For Black and colored communities, the experience of being tokenized or exoticized is all too familiar. True engagement requires a commitment to building authentic relationships, listening to the experiences of others, and learning from their perspectives. This means moving beyond superficial interactions and engaging in deep and meaningful dialogue. It means challenging one's own biases and assumptions. It means recognizing the humanity of others and valuing their lived experiences. For Black and colored communities, this means building alliances with those who are committed to justice, sharing their stories, and working together to create a more equitable society. So, where do we go from here? Dr. Cleveland's message isn't just a theological thought experiment. It's a stark reality check, a wake-up call for those of us who've been living in a privileged echo chamber. For Black and colored majority communities, this isn't abstract. It's the air they breathe, the daily struggle against a system rigged against them. It's a message that screams, justice delayed is justice denied, and frankly, we've delayed far too long. This isn't about feeling guilty, it's about getting woke, truly awake, to the ways our privilege props up structures of domination. It's about recognizing that thoughts and prayers won't dismantle systemic racism. It's about moving beyond the comfortable pew and into the streets, the boardrooms, the halls of power, wherever injustice festers. Cleveland offers a framework, a blueprint, not just for understanding, but for action. It's a challenge to trade that comfortable illusion of righteousness for the hard, messy work of building a truly equitable society. It's a call to embody Jesus' radical love, to truly love thy neighbor as ourselves, even when it costs us. Because, let's be real, true change always comes with a cost. This isn't about being a savior, it's about being an ally. It's about amplifying marginalized voices, not speaking over them. It's about recognizing that talk is cheap. And true solidarity means putting our resources, our influence, our very comfort on the line. Ultimately, this is about building a world where liberty and justice for all isn't just a hollow promise, but a lived reality. A world where the last shall be first isn't just a biblical metaphor, but a tangible expression of God's kingdom on earth. So, let's ditch the complacency, let's challenge the status quo, and let's get to work. Because the time for change isn't coming, it's now.